All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, thank you for joining us for our Liberty Science Center Jennifer Chelsea Planetarium online program about tonight's supermoon. I'm Mike, the planetarium director, and our program is going to allow us to explore what to expect to see tonight and what a supermoon is. And we'll give you a few other things to see in the sky tonight as well. As I was saying, although the weather is not looking amazing tonight, if anything's going to break through the clouds, it'll be the moon. It'll be there all night long. And tomorrow morning, at least for the New Jersey, New York area, where they are predicting clear skies in the morning before the first light of day. And then tomorrow, the moon will be almost a repeat of tonight's moon. It'll still be for just about a full moon. So thanks again for joining us. So keep your comments coming on the chat. Andrew on our staff is also going to be on the chat, and he'll be responding to questions that you have as they come in. And we'll leave some time at the end of the show as well to take your questions. Our program will last about 25 minutes. So I also wanted to mention we do this usually on Thursdays at 1 o'clock during the time Liberty Science Center is closed. And tomorrow at 1, we're going to be having Andrew talk about Pluto and what makes a planet a planet. We get more questions about Pluto than almost anything else on these programs. We figured let's do a whole show about that one topic. And these are also all available on our homepage as YouTube videos after we actually do the Facebook Live program. So with that said, let's begin where all astronomy has its origins. We're going to go out to the nighttime sky, but not tonight. We'll get there in a moment. But we're going to go back in time 11 days and look at the sky just before sunset on April 26th. So a week ago Sunday. So there is the sun blazing away in the sky. We're going to go a little bit later in the evening and see what the phase of the moon was like back on the 26th of April, again, about 11 days ago. Sun goes down. We're going to stop at 9:15, looking over towards the western sky. Take a moment, scan the western sky as you would have seen it back on April 26th, and try to spot the moon. As you look around, that night, the moon was close to the planet Venus, and that evening, it was an early crescent. So this side of the moon, as you're facing it, the right side was lit, which makes sense. At night, you had the sun that just set here in the west. The sun's rays are striking this side of the moon and giving us an early crescent. And back on the 26th, it was right next to the blazing dot of the planet Venus. So that was what we saw in the sky back on the 26th of April. Now, planetariums are good time machines. We're going to jump forward, not very far. We're going to go forward a few days to the 29th of April, that Wednesday night, and see what the phase of the moon was on April 29. April 29 is, of course, exactly a week ago from today. So here we are going out on April 29, last Wednesday, a week ago today. Scan the skies and try to spot the moon. So how has the moon changed besides, it's made a couple of changes. One, it's moved all the way from down here by Venus, where it was 3 days earlier, to there. And also, instead of being a little crescent, it's now what's often called a half moon. Half the side of the moon facing us is lit. Confusingly, a half moon, as we have here, is also called a quarter moon because the moon is actually 1/4 of the way in its orbit around the Earth, its monthly orbit. So that was the view exactly a week ago on Wednesday, the 29th. All right, so now, without further ado, let's go to today's date and see what the moon's going to look like. Same time of night, 9:15 today. I'm going to keep looking towards the western sky, as we've done in our first two observations. And wait, as we look towards the west, there is no moon to be seen here at 9:15. Well, let's think about that. So when we first saw the moon near Venus on the 26th of April, it was over here. 3 days later, it was over here. So maybe it's over here, maybe we have to actually turn ourselves around and look towards the eastern sky to try to spot the moon tonight. Haha, and there it is. So there we have the full moon at 9:15 tonight, as you'd see it, rising up. So there we have our moon this evening, which will be, as we'll explain in a moment, a little bigger and brighter than a normal full moon. So planetariums nowadays, we've got this whole little, let's go through the little cycle here. So we began on our first observation on the 26th of April with a crescent moon lit from the right-hand side. 3 days later, on the 29th of April, we had a half moon, again lit from the right. A week later, it was the full moon we see tonight. And after that, the moon's going to get thinner and thinner, going down to a third quarter moon about a week from now, although now lit from the left-hand side, then a little crescent, and then we'll have a new moon we can't see by the 22nd of May. So it always goes in the same cycle and always takes 29.5 days to go through this cycle. Let's leap off of Earth, which we can do in modern day planetariums, and see what's going on here. So here we have a view from above. There is the sun. There's the Earth. And here is where the moon was back on the 26th, our first observation. So a little sliver lit from the right-hand side is what we saw, which is what we observed in the sky that Sunday night as well. And I should mention, the moon is always half lit and half unlit. What changes is not that. What changes is how much of the lit side of the moon we see as the moon goes around the Earth. So let's send the moon on its merry way as it does orbit our home planet. And as it comes around, we'll see more and more of the lit side of the moon as we head towards the 29th, our second observation. And we're going to keep on going around until we hit the exact moment when the moon is full. Now, I get that question a lot. Like, Mike, what do you mean by saying that there's an actual moment when the moon is full? Well, the moon is full when you have a straight line between the sun, the Earth, and the moon. So now we're seeing the entire lit side of the moon from Earth. And you may want to notice that the actual moment of full moon is not tonight. It's on May 7. In fact, this moment of the straight line between sun, Earth, and moon happens at 6:45 Eastern Daylight Time tomorrow morning, the 7th, Thursday morning. But being full then, the moon's going to look a little fuller tonight leading up to that than the moon that's going to rise on the evening of May 7th. So we're referring to this as being the night of the full moon. So that straight line is the exact moment when the moon is full. And then, of course, the moon keeps on its voyage, its 29.5-day trip around our home planet. And as we come around to the third quarter moon, around the 14th of May, now as you're looking at the moon from Earth, it's actually going to be the left side that's lit, not the right side. And it will get more and more and more and more and more slender until you have another situation where you have the moon, the sun, and the Earth in a straight line. But now we have the moon in between the Earth and the sun. And now from Earth, we cannot see the lit side of the moon at all. The moon is lost in the blazing light of the sun. You can't ever see a new moon when the moon is in this position, except for those rare and magic occasions where the moon blocks off part of the sun and causes a partial or a total solar eclipse. I'm going to take a moment here to look at a couple of questions. Tim is wondering, is the supermoon always a full moon? The person who invented this, as we'll talk about in a moment, actually talked about super full moons and super new moons. He was an astrologer who believed that the things like the moon had an influence on human life. So to him, it mattered if you had a new moon that was close to Earth or a full moon. But you can't see a new moon, so no one really seemed to catch fire with the idea of a super new moon. So when the term supermoon is used nowadays, it almost always refers to a full moon. We'll get to that in just a moment. Just checking to see if there's any more immediate questions I can respond to here. And yes, we'd like to thank both Andrew, our programmer, and Digistar, the software, for bringing these things to life. So we're going to now, what we've done so far is explain what causes the phases of the moon. And if you've grasped that, then you've grasped an important concept. It's very important in school, what causes these phases. But we also have to be talking about like what makes a supermoon. So as I was saying a moment ago, the term supermoon nowadays applies primarily to the full moon because the idea of a full moon that's a little closer is really kind of cool. Now, here is the moon going around the Earth. And the moon does not go around in a perfect circle. Almost no body orbits another body in a perfect circle. So when the moon is close to Earth, at a place called perigee, it's about 224,000 miles away, give or take a couple thousand miles. And when it's at its furthest point, because again, the orbit is oval or elliptical, it's quite a bit further away. It is about 252,000 miles and change. So there's roughly a 30,000 mile difference between the moon at its closest point and at its most distant point. So when it's furthest from the Earth, the moon is said to be at apogee. And when it's nearest to the Earth, it's at perigee. So let's talk about the moon and what's going on tonight and why this is a supermoon, but just barely a supermoon. So we've actually had the moon already pass through perigee for this orbit. It actually was at the closest point to Earth yesterday at 11:03 in the evening Eastern Daylight Time. So that has already happened. The moon has already made its closest approach to the Earth in this current orbit. And it was about 221,772 miles away. So that's how far away the moon was last night at 11:03. The full moon is going to occur tomorrow morning at 6:45 in the morning, about 31 hours after the moon was at its closest point. So that's where the moon will be when it is full tomorrow morning at 6:45. So the person who actually invented, so the term supermoon is a very recent term. Most of what we discuss in astronomy goes back hundreds or thousands of years. But in the case of the supermoon idea, it was invented in 1979 by an astrologer who's still active today. His name is Richard Knoll. He's still on LinkedIn. And he defined a supermoon as being a full moon that occurs when the moon is at least within 90% of perigee, or the moon's closest approach. And so the moon is tomorrow morning, when it's full, going to still be within 90% of being at the closest point. By about 400 miles, it's inside of that limit. And so because of that, by his definition, his defining definition, we do have a full moon tomorrow morning that's within 90% of the moon being at its closest point as it goes around the Earth. Now, things have evolved in the idea of the supermoon. It really caught fire in the OOs. We didn't really talk about it in the 70s and 80s, but in the OOs, it became a major media event. And some folks have reclassified a supermoon, not as being a full moon that happens within 90% of being at perigee, but a full moon that happens within 24 hours of the moon being at its closest point to the Earth. By that definition, this event tonight is not a supermoon because it's well after that 24-hour limit. The moon is full 31 hours after perigee. But by Richard Knoll's defining definition, because the moon, when it's full tomorrow morning, will be well within the 90% of the closest approach to the Earth limit, it is going to be a supermoon and should look really quite lovely once we finally get it beyond the clouds. So that is what a supermoon is. It's a full moon that occurs when the moon is closer than usual in its regular path around our planet Earth, within 90% of being at its closest point. So having framed that, I see a lot of questions coming in asking about what a supermoon is. So yeah, that basically is what a supermoon is. It's a full moon that occurs when the moon is closer than normal in its orbit around planet Earth. Now we're going to the sky tonight. Here is my fanciful fantasy sky with no clouds whatsoever. Although again, tomorrow morning we are hoping that things will be much better. We'll look at the morning sky as well. So the moon rises around 7:10 tonight. So right now it's 5:15 if you're watching this live. So a couple hours from now, keep your eyes peeled. The moon as it rises will be kind of fighting with the light of the setting sun. So it'll take a moment as it's coming up for you to catch it. But by 7:20, it will have entirely cleared the horizon. So go ahead and search that eastern horizon, see if you can pick out the moon as it's coming up. So right here over a perfectly flat horizon, you'd be able to catch the moon if it was a clear sky. And so I should mention, Molly's asking from the New York metro area, where will the moon be when it's full tomorrow at 6:45? It'll have just gone below the horizon. It'll have set by then. So by the time it's actually at the moment of absolute fullness, it'll have just gone below the horizon. Now the moon is going to be hard to see when it first comes up, but it'll keep climbing and will be pretty clear to see if you have any breaks at all in the clouds as we get to a little bit later, say 9:15 or so. So we'll bring our moon up a little bit higher. The sun now going down below the horizon behind our backs gives us a much better view of it by the time we get to 9:15. Now here's the thing, as the moon rises, it may look absolutely enormous. And sometimes I get calls of folks asking, saying, is that because of it being a supermoon? Well, a little bit, but whenever the moon rises, because you're seeing it next to buildings and trees and other things that you know and love, the moon always looks bigger when it's rising than when it's high overhead. So it's going to be quite striking as it rises, but it always is when it's coming up. And in fact, little known fact, the moon is further away by about 4,000 miles when it rises than when it's overhead. To explain that, so here we have the moon, 221,000 miles away, and here we have an observer on Earth. When the moon is over her head, as she looks up, it's only 221,000 miles to the moon. Now here's another observer, and he's watching the moon rise, and the moon is looking much bigger to him because he's seeing it rise over buildings and street lamps. But actually, as he's observing the moon rise, the observer has to look over half the diameter of the Earth, 4,000 miles, and then has to look to 221,000 miles to the moon. So a moon that's rising or setting, you're looking over the half the width of the Earth, 4,000 miles, besides the distance from the Earth to the moon. So you are, in fact, seeing a slightly smaller moon. But that's canceled out by the fact that as the moon rises, you see it next to all these amazing trees and buildings, and it just looks enormous. And that's just as true of the moon tonight as even a crescent moon that is lowering close to the horizon. So as you're out today or tomorrow, a couple of things also not to miss. The moon is the brightest thing in the sky at night. The second brightest thing is also blazing away for about 3 more weeks. The planet Venus is also in the sky, low in the western sky, so the opposite direction of where the moon will be rising. And the planet Venus is generally, as tonight, our nearest planet, 36 million miles away, which is close for a planet, although it's still 140 times further away than the moon is tonight. And Venus is covered in really bright, really shiny clouds. And so because of that, it looks extremely bright when we see it from planet Earth. And so you'll be seeing this blaze of light. It's been with us ever since Thanksgiving. So it's been with us for 6 months as a blazing beacon in the sky. But we're going to lose Venus by the end of May. So go ahead, make sure you get out there and check out Venus as you're out there and about trying to find the moon as well. Venus will be there till roughly 10-ish, 10:30 tonight. So we lose Venus by the end of May. And before that, we actually lose the classic stars of winter even earlier than that. So right down there on the horizon, on the other side of west from where Venus is the brightest star in the sky. And here at 9:15, which is the time we're at right now, or 9:30, I'm sorry, 9:30, it's still blazing. It's called Sirius the Dog Star. The word Sirius comes from a Greek phrase meaning fire. And over when I lived in Hawaii, we called this fire, or a'a is a Hawaiian term for that. So this blazing dot of light, you're going to see it right on the horizon, and it's going to be scintillating crazy as it shines through the thick atmosphere near the horizon. So try to catch that bright dot. And then above that, look for the stick figure of just two stars joined together to form the little dog. The stars Procyon and Mesa go together. That's a little tough to see. More commonsensical, maybe. Here we have Pollux and Castor, the bright stars that form the heads of the Gemini twins. They're going to be in the sky till the middle of June. And then next to them, we have the constellation of Auriga, the last in this gathering of bright constellations from the winter sky. Auriga, so obviously, if you look really closely, a man holding a baby goat as he drives a chariot. The bright star here is actually called the little goat or Capella. Now, you may have heard that there's a comet in the sky called Comet Swan, and in early June, that comet will be close to this bright star, Capella. So comets are notoriously unpredictable. Most of the great motions of the sky, like lunar phases, can be predicted hundreds, thousands of years in advance. Comets, we don't know what we're going to see until they appear. But it may be bright enough by June 2nd and 3rd to see this Comet Swan next to the bright star Capella. So stay tuned. I'm sure we'll update you on that as we figure out. Like many folks in my field, we've promoted comets that have sometimes turned out beautifully and sometimes have never been able to be seen by the naked eye. So that is the western sky and the last hurrah for the bright stars of the winter. But if we turn around and look for the classic archetypal constellation of the spring, that one is called Leo, the lion. And like the Gemini, Leo is one of the 12 signs of the zodiac. Here is the head of the lion, the mane, and here are the back haunches as well. So Leo the lion, high in the southern sky and easy to spot with its backwards question mark. As we're still here, someone is asking about where's the Big Dipper. The Big Dipper is actually behind us, and the Big Dipper is really high in the sky. Nisha, it's about as high as it ever gets. We never lose the Big Dipper from here in New Jersey, but it's as high as it ever gets here. So it's back behind us in the northern sky. So we're still tonight. It's still 9:30. We still have that supermoon where we left it before we did a little turn around the sky. So the moon is going to be in the sky all night long. So that's one advantage of a supermoon. It comes up at sunset, is overhead all night, goes down at sunrise, and it's so bright that if anything can break through these clouds, it'll be the supermoon. So let's go through the evening and keep an eye on that as we go to just before the first light of dawn. Why is he called Leo? Daria is wondering. That's because Leo is the Latin word for lion. So if you know someone named Leo, that person is named after the idea of a lion. So many folks named Leo. Also, I mean, sometimes it's inspired by Leo, sometimes by just the term Leopold. I don't know many friends who are named Scorpius. That's another constellation that stands out very nicely in the pre-dawn sky. So here is the claw, the star Antares, and then the stinger for the scorpion that is in the morning sky. It's a third of the zodiac signs we've seen in the course of our program. And if you're up early, and again, we're hoping for clear weather tomorrow morning, and the scorpion is going to be shining there in the morning sky around about 4:30 before the first rays of dawn. Although if you're up early, you're not going to really notice the scorpion. You're going to notice the still bright moon. Now the moon's going to set around 6, so right before it officially becomes full at 6:45. We're just going to miss that exact moment. You'll see the brilliant moon, and on the other side of the scorpion, you're going to see a brilliant dot of light that is almost as vivid and compelling as Venus is at night. So the brightest thing at night is the moon, the second brightest is Venus, and this object is the third brightest thing you'll see in the nighttime sky. It is the giant planet Jupiter. 13 times more distant than Venus, but Jupiter is enormous, reflects light really well, and so although it's 6 times dimmer than Venus, it's still so bright that it outshines every other dot in the sky, including every star. Tonight, if you had a telescope on Jupiter, you'd see 3 of the 4 bright moons that orbit it, called the Galilean Moons, because he discovered them when he invented the telescope back in 1610. Now, if that's not enough, if you look beside this brilliant dot of Jupiter, you'll have the somewhat fainter dot of what is still the most beloved of the planets, the planet Saturn. Now, Galileo's telescope was not good enough to show the rings of Saturn, but by the mid-17th century, telescope makers made scopes good enough to show this awesome sight. To this day, when we show Saturn in a telescope to people at Liberty Science Center, guaranteed, the first reaction is it doesn't look real. It's hard to believe that this could really exist. And so imagine how it must have really blown the minds of the first astronomers of the mid-17th century who had telescopes good enough to see the rings of Saturn. And if that's not enough, if you hold your hand out, 2 palms, put them beside Saturn, going to the left, you'll find the planet Mars as well, slightly orange in color and slightly brighter than Saturn is right now. Saturn, not a beauty shot in the same way that Saturn is in a telescope, but a very intriguing world. We've explored the planet for decades and have sent more spacecraft to the planet Mars than any other planet in the solar system. We do hope eventually to make it a site of a human mission, although, as we'll talk about at the end of the show, getting to Mars with a spaceship and a human mission, major, major undertaking. So here we are again in the morning sky tomorrow morning at about 4:30. So again, and we do hope for clear skies, right? So if you're an early riser, get up and see this tomorrow morning, the supermoon, the constellation of the Scorpion, and then Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. Now, when I lived in Hawaii, the term we had for this constellation was not the Scorpion. In fact, they didn't have scorpions in Hawaii until after Western contact. The term in Hawaii is Maui's Great Fishhook, a term you may know if you have seen the Disney film Moana, which does a very nice evocation of that constellation. And that term goes back at least 800 years, Maui's Big Fishhook. You find it also in New Zealand, that term for these stars. The constellation of the Scorpion was invented about 2,500 years ago. So we're using these names that were invented hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, because the stars are so far away, we don't really see them move in a human lifetime. You're not going to see this star here go this way tomorrow, nor is this star Antares going to go that way. A way to think of that, stars are like cars on a very distant freeway, where it's hard to see that they're moving unless you give it a lot of time. On the other hand, the planets and the moon are like the cars whizzing by right in front of your house. You can see them zip by pretty quickly. In fact, the very term planet comes from a Greek phrase meaning wandering star. And to the Greeks, the sun and the moon were planets as well because they did the one thing that planets had to do. They wandered against the starry background. So we're going to now do a little time lapse. So if you're out there tomorrow morning and you see a thing moving as you look at it, you're not seeing a planet. You may be seeing either an airplane, if it goes and lands at Newark Airport, or you're seeing a satellite if it has a very steady pace across the sky. However, if you just give it a couple of days, if you do a time lapse, you can clearly see that the moon and the planets move against the fixed background of stars. And as I said earlier, the moon is a little speed demon. It goes around the entire sky once in 30 days. So by Friday morning the 8th, it's coming Friday, if you're up early at 4:30, you'll find the moon in the claw of the Scorpion. And if we keep on going to the 9th and the 10th, so by the time you get to the 11th, you're going to have the moon hanging like a pendulum down below both Saturn and Jupiter. So that should be a lovely sight at 4:30 in the morning, this coming Monday, the 11th. And then if we keep on going, it's going to join the planet Mars on the 14th. So here we have the planet Mars with its very slight orange color, and then like a little again, pendant or pendulum, you'll have the waning moon hanging down below that. This motion, by the way, will take Jupiter and Saturn, with the turning of the sky in general, to a point where in the summer sky, they'll be visible by 10 o'clock easily, which will really make for some convenient planet watching. So that pattern, that motion of the stars was so important, it so impressed our ancestors. They named these moving objects after the most important thing, not after scorpions and lions, but after the gods and goddesses of their culture. Artemis or Diana, the goddess of the moon, for example, or Jupiter, the king of the gods, or Mars, the god of war. Now, to wrap up our program, let's take a few moments to look at the moon itself. So the moon is a place that has no atmosphere, no air. Craters formed long ago or have been there for billions of years. And it is also the only place beyond Earth where we sent human missions. So the first human mission to the moon was in December of 1968, when the Apollo 8 mission, to prepare the way for the Apollo 11 landing 7 months later, went and orbited the moon in December of that year. As you may have heard from your history books or not, December 1968 was a pretty rough year overall, with assassinations and the war and so forth. And to end the year by this vision of the Earth from the moon, from these orbiting astronauts, was a way, it was called the mission that salvaged the year 1968, and gave a real incentive to the environmental movement to actually see our planet Earth seen from 250,000 miles away. So that was Apollo 8. And they, again, prepared the way for the more famous mission to the moon, Apollo 11, which on July 20, 1969, landed on the moon. We just celebrated that anniversary just this last summer. So a total of 6 Apollo missions went to the moon, and the last 3 actually had moon buggies that allowed the astronauts to get pretty far away from their landing point and explore the moon in more detail. So the last time a human set foot upon the moon was in December of 1972, when the Apollo 17 mission, leaving behind its rover, blasted off to return to our home planet. But there are hopes afoot, plans afoot to get back there. We have right now the Artemis Program getting underway, a collaboration of NASA, European Space Agency, and commercial spaceflight, where they're hoping to get a mission with a crew back to the moon sometime in this decade, and also for the first time have a woman walking upon the moon. So that's called the Artemis Program, and we're hoping that will pave the way for, first of all, being able to have a permanent presence on the moon, and by doing that, to really prepare the way to test out our endurance and everything else that we need to eventually make the next great leap of going to the planet Mars. Now, to the moon and back took 2 weeks. Mars and back is going to take 3 years with the human mission. So it definitely is something that's going to be a major undertaking, but it is the next logical step and is also a step where a moon mission is going to really play an important role. So that is our program. Again, we like to thank Digistar, which is a software by Evans and Sutherland that has allowed us to bring the planetarium right to your screens here. And now, if you have any other questions, please go ahead and type them in, and we will try to address those either by typing or by verbally responding. Yes, Phil was saying that 1968 I was around then. It was a really brutal year. And here, these astronauts discussing the beauty of the moon as they were orbiting it in December of that year. It was right around Christmas time, within a day or two of Christmas. I think they did a Christmas Eve broadcast back to the planet. Okay, great question from Vaishali. How often is there a supermoon? There's usually 2 or 3 a year. The next one's not going to be till April, so it's not that rare of a phenomenon. But 2 or 3 times a year, there is a full moon that occurs when the moon is within 90% of its closest approach to the Earth. Someone has Starry Night. Where can I find this? I'm not sure which version. I use Starry Night occasionally. This is I'm not sure. I haven't used it much for zooming in. Stellarium also can be quite useful. It's a free downloadable program called Stellarium that can also put a planetarium on your screen. Scrolling down here. So Jill is wondering, why is there not a supermoon every 29.5 years when the moon is closest in that cycle? Uh, the point of the approach's approach varies dramatically as it goes around. So you don't always have the perigee lining up with when the moon is full. It happens at different points. So here's a really good example of that. So on the first day of summer, June 21, we actually are going to have the moon at apogee when it's at its furthest point from the Earth. So the new moon on June 21 is going to be further away than normal and smaller, and is going to, therefore, when it blocks off the sun that day in an eclipse, not be large enough to block off the entire sun. So instead of seeing a total solar eclipse, the folks who get to see it, will be in Africa and Asia, will see the sun as a ring shining around the moon. You don't have that wonderful darkness in the middle of the day effect that you get with a total solar eclipse. The next supermoon, Molly is wondering, after this one, will be in April of next year. How big is the supermoon? The moon is the same size as always. It appears bigger because it's closer to us. And so the moon is only about a few thousand miles in diameter. And it's going to be it just looks closer to us. Sharu is wondering, what is the brightest constellation? I think that honor has to go to Orion the Hunter. Now, we just lost Orion. Like literally last week, it began to plunge behind the sun. But Orion has got such bright and distinctive stars that pops out more than any other of the constellations, of the 88 constellations that we know of. Corey is wondering, and Bryn, 6 years old, wondering, why does the moon orbit the Earth? Well, we're pretty sure that there was a colossal impact with the Earth when it was forming billions of years ago, which nearly destroyed the Earth and knocked off material that then coalesced into the moon. And being ejected from the Earth, it was so close that the moon's gravity held it in its grip, and it wound up being the only permanent satellite of our home planet, at least natural satellite. Sandy is wondering where Polaris is right now. Polaris, the North Star, is in the north. It's the one star that doesn't move. Polaris stays right in the north. It is 40 degrees above the horizon, just about halfway between the horizon and the top of the sky in the north. Whatever your latitude is in the northern hemisphere, the North Star is that far above the horizon. So here it's at 40 degrees above the horizon because we're at 40 degrees north latitude here in New Jersey. And so it is, as the one star that doesn't move, it's over the North Pole. The axis of our rotation, as we spin, it stays in place. So if you want to see the North Star move, you have to change your location north or south. That's the only thing that's going to change where the North Star is in the sky. Oh, great question from Nihal. Where can we see Mercury? Mercury is not visible yet, but by the 21st of May, so not too far away, if you look at Venus on May 21st and 22nd, right next to it, the somewhat dimmer dot will be Mercury, and then Mercury will slowly go up in the western sky until about into early June. They say 1 person in 1,000 sees Mercury and knows they're seeing it. It is elusive because it only appears right after sunset or right before sunrise, but we do have a chance to see it at the end of May and the early part of June. If you try to find it on June 21, it will help you to find the blazing dot of Venus, and then right below it, the little dot of Mercury. But yes, it's the only of the 5 planets you can see without a telescope. It is the one that is by far the trickiest, always somewhat lost in the light of the setting or the rising sun. Why does the moon look like it has a face? That's a question from Kathy. Great question. So humans have always had a very vivid imagination, I think, in looking upon the moon. And so in Western culture, we often talk about seeing the man in the moon with 2 eyes and kind of a howling face. Although over in China, for example, there's a common story about a rabbit being on the moon. We do have very active imaginations, I think, when it comes to astronomy. We showed you the little dog and how you take 2 little stars and turn that into a dog. Hey, we're an imaginative bunch of people. Now, the face question also, there's another thing I wanted to address. there's a rumor going around that the crescent moon and Venus and Jupiter will look like a smiley face on May 16th. And I'm afraid that's not going to happen. It could happen at some point, but in fact, Jupiter and Venus are going to be in completely different parts of the sky. And so if you've seen that meme that's been making the rounds about there being a smiley face caused by the crescent moon and the dots of Jupiter and Venus, that is not happening on the 16th. The two planets will be way apart from each other at that time, and the moon won't be near either one of them. We'll take two more questions before we wrap it up. So Catherine is wondering, can you look directly at a full lunar eclipse? And the answer is yes, 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 yes. So lunar eclipses, which is when the moon goes into the shadow of the Earth, are only occur during full moons. And what happens during a total lunar eclipse is that because the Earth is blocking off light of the sun from hitting the moon turns dark and often turns kind of a eerie copper color. Now it's going to be a long time before we have a good lunar eclipse here in the New Jersey area. It's kind of a sparse year anyway for lunar eclipses. We're actually going to have one technically on July 4 here in the Northeast, but it's a penumbral lunar eclipse, which is a kind of lunar eclipse where not much of the Earth's shadow falls on the moon, and you'll probably not be able to see any difference. But yes, unlike solar eclipses, where you can never observe a solar eclipse, partial solar eclipse without a safe viewing filter, it's totally safe to view any and all phases of a total eclipse of the moon. We had a question about how do constellations form from Victoria. Well, every culture has looked up and imagined different constellations. The ones we use primarily, in the northern part of the sky at least, were ones either invented by the Greeks and Romans or they borrowed them from earlier cultures like the Babylonians. But also some of the constellation names for the constellations in the southern hemisphere were only invented by astronomers in the 17th century when the first reports came back from Europeans of the stars below the equator that no one had seen in the northern hemisphere. And then in 1922, to avoid confusion, the International Astronomical Union got together and agreed upon 88 official constellations that now serve as a map to the nighttime sky. And that actually is a good way to end in mentioning the International Astronomical Union. They are the only organization that has the right to name things in the sky. And so they assigned the sky to 88 official constellations in 1922. And in 2006, they reclassified Pluto from being a planet to being a dwarf planet. And tomorrow at 1 o'clock on our regular time for our Planetarium On Live programming, our Facebook Live will be all about Pluto and what makes a planet a planet. And as a reminder, we save these presentations in YouTube format on our homepage. And so if you want to catch that one or any of our other shows, then those are all right there to review if you can't make it at 1 o'clock live tomorrow. So with that, we're going to go ahead and sign off and keep on visiting us at our usual time, 1 o'clock on Thursdays for our regular Planetarium live programming. And catch all of our other great online programming if you go to our homepage, LSC in the House. We have lots of other content. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you when hopes tomorrow at one of our later broadcasts.